Why did Soviet people tolerate this system? Why did they participate in it? There is no one simple explanation. First of all, there was fear and feelings of insecurity which permeated the whole society. People lived with a constant fear of persecution, particularly in the late 1930s. The regime encouraged informers, and people reported on one another. Often they did it out of fear of being reported themselves. Many old scores and old quarrels were settled this way. Everyone was in danger, but fear was not the only factor, and perhaps not even the most important one. Second, the state had a complete monopoly on all spheres of social life. Information of any kind was supplied only by the state media, and the state media was strictly vetted. Education was provided only by state institutions, and the state closely watched what was taught or performed. Cultural institutions were vetted also. History was rewritten time and again depending on the political situation, and each new version increased Stalin's role. In each new version, Stalin occupied a more central place in historical events. His former colleagues, dead or in the camps, disappeared from history. Their books in the libraries were destroyed or banned, and it was suicidal to keep such books at home. Propaganda was in this situation a particularly powerful tool. Propaganda was used to create a kind of an alternative reality. In it, Stalin and the party were infallible. The USSR was the most prosperous and happy state. Soviet citizens had to attend multiple lectures on current affairs presented to them at their workplace by professional propagandists. They also had to participate in meetings denouncing or hailing whoever the government wanted them to or instructed them to do. Both the denunciations and the hailing were emotionally perceived and were usually expressed with passion, mostly sincerely, because this was what people did throughout their lives. The salient points of Stalin's propaganda were: first, the October Revolution was the most important event in history. Second, the Soviet Union was the only guarantee of a bright socialist future for humanity. Third, only the Soviet Communist Party knew the way to that bright socialist future. And fourth, only Stalin could lead the party correctly along that way. Campaigns against various enemies of the people and of the Soviet state in this situation were necessary to keep the Soviet population united, enthusiastically compliant, and permanently mobilized. This was despite the hardships of every day and despite the repression. Stalin's propaganda could only be successful, and his power system could only exist in a situation where the majority of the population, or a significant part of it, believed that socialism was a far superior system compared to any other economic model. So the majority of Soviet people did believe that socialism, with a centralized economy and state regulation and redistribution, was a far fairer system than any other. Many were ready to sacrifice their lives for it. They believed that ultimately, once all the enemies were crushed, the system would bring them prosperity. Many sincerely believed that they were building this bright future, whatever the hurdles on the way, even if these hurdles were their own lives. Stalin created a fearful and obedient officialdom, which faithfully and enthusiastically helped him to implement his policies. Stalin's selection and culling of the party and state officials resulted in a particular mold of the top layer of Soviet society. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet elite consisted only of Stalin's protégés and of the protégés of these protégés, selected and reselected several times over. Several other points that were important. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Russia lost most of its educated and politically conscious elite. It was easier for any dictator to convince the less literate and politically inexperienced population that whatever he did was done in the interest of the people. One should also not forget that after the horrors of the World War, the Revolution and the Civil War, a relative stability of Stalin's first years in power must have seemed a blessing. Finally, the centuries-long Russian tradition of autocracy played a part too. It should be remembered that for centuries Russia was an autocracy. There was no independent civil or religious institutions. There was no civil society. The unlimited power of the monarchy resulted in the weakness of the institution of private property, even among the landed owing class. Stalinism fell well within this traditional historical track. How much of Stalinism was Stalin's creation? Stalin's system of power was a dictatorship. Few historians disagree about its nature. The argument is about how much of it was created by Stalin himself. That is, whether it was really Stalinist. There's no doubt that Stalin's personal quality had a big impact on his policy and the way it was implemented. What were these qualities? He was inventively and viciously cruel. He was vindictive and suspicious. He treated both his enemies and his closest followers with guile. He was rough and intolerant. He firmly believed that he alone knew best everywhere. He had a unique ability to manipulate people. All this played a big role in creating his power mode. Bolsheviks generally had little regard for human life, particularly after they seized power. Stalin's predecessors either killed their opponents or kept them in prison. Stalin went much further in the scale of repression, and he also found a practical use for those who were left alive. This was slave labor. It was Lenin, not Stalin, who introduced a ban on factions within the party, but Stalin criminalized these factions and used it to silence any internal party debate. Lenin's generation of Bolsheviks knew that an attempt at socialist transformation of a backward Russian society would require a lot of social engineering. They went ahead regardless, but none of them was so decisive and ruthless in it as Stalin. Lenin's regime was built on ideology, and so was Stalin's. Lenin, however, was usually able to adjust ideology to reality. when the situation required. Stalin played with Marxist theory at will, but with a few exceptions, he adjusted reality to suit his ideology, not vice versa. We know that Lenin was admired and glorified by a large proportion of the Soviet population, but Stalin consciously and carefully created his own personality cult. He worked very hard on it. Stalin introduced several entirely new features into Soviet ideology. For example, Russian nationalism, chauvinism, which was not recognized by Bolsheviks of the Lenin generation. There was also anti-Semitism, which was not acceptable to the first generation of Bolsheviks. But ultimately, Stalinism was not a radical departure from Leninism. It was a continuation, development, and radicalization of Leninism in a new era. How does one assess Stalinism? The different assessments of Stalin and Stalinism are based on two entirely different premises. The first one emphasizes the glory of the state. The second centers on the human tragedy of Soviet population and on the ineffectiveness of Stalin's economic system.